Okay, here we are back for round 3, the final round of our unit on the Great War. And I'll confess, I started this a few minutes ago, and I got about 2 minutes into it, and I spilled coffee all over my desk and my computer. My computer's fine, I'm fine, we're back. You guys have no idea how dangerous this job actually is, and how much I sacrifice for you. Anyway, it's a blank screen because I want to set the table here before finishing this off. What I didn't get to last time, before we get to the consequences, which is the main feature of the film tonight, but I'd like to do a little bit of a zoom in, a specific look at trench warfare and the life in the trenches on the Western Front. And I do so by primarily quoting from a book that you'll see momentarily. And so I have a series of slides with visuals that kind of take you through a day in the life of a person on the Western Front. Could be German, British, French, whoever. And I think it gives us a better sense of the horrors of trench warfare. Maybe we already have a sense of it from your reading and the lecture heretofore, but I think this deepens our understanding of this. There's something about World War I, and again, more specifically, the war on the Western Front here in France and Flanders, that is particularly frightening. I know warfare is, of any kind, any war is no picnic, and there's always death and destruction and gruesome horrors and bloody violence. But there's something about the First World War that stands out. And I'm not sure I can even put my finger on exactly what it is. Trench warfare is somewhat unique, but it's not just that. I think it has something to do, though I wouldn't say this goes far enough. It has something to do with how futile all of this seems. The way that things shook out wasn't planned this way at the beginning of the war. Everyone kind of fell into this once the stalemate happened on the Western Front, and everyone dug in. But it seems like an exercise in repeated futility to the point of to the extent of the death of millions of people. So here we go. The miserable life in the trenches itself, even when there wasn't an attack, as you see here, is that soldier manning a trench, but they're not under attack at the moment. At least it doesn't appear that way. So even when the trenches weren't being obliterated by shell fire from artillery, enemy artillery, life was still awful. The conditions were just terrible most of the time. And I'm quoting here, as I said, from what I think is the best single volume book on World War I ever written, called Rites of Spring, by a East European scholar named Modris Ecksteins. Not a name you hear a lot here. And it's somewhat dated. I think the book is about 15 years old now. And it's not entirely about the combat and the military campaigns and battles of the war. Part of it's about the way in which World War I changed European culture. And that part of it is fascinating in its own right. But the section that does give you a chronological rehashing of the events in the war, and sort of looking at the horrors of trench warfare as we're doing here, is particularly good. And just so we can kind of stay on the same page, I had to chop the quotes up a little bit to keep them concise and to make the points I want. So they're not always syntactically correct. So sometimes they're not completely coherent in every way, but I mean, I'll make them coherent to the best of my ability. So what follows then, a day in the life in the trenches, with quotes from Professor Eckstein's book. Dirt and filth were constant companions. Soaked through and freezing, the trenches were infested with vermin, flies, mites, nits, fleas, mosquitoes, and beetles. Lice laid their eggs in the seams of garments and multiplied at a terrifying rate. Rats, the size of cats, were reported in the trenches. And you know why the rats were so large. They had a lot to eat. Sorry, but it's true. The battle against the rats was as serious at times as that against the enemy. The odor of decomposition, one of those areas where it kind of jumps around. The odor of decomposition, not of rats, was inescapable curses. Limbs and torsos were churned up again and again by the shelling. Can one exaggerate the horrors of trench life? Over the top. This is still a phrase in our lexicon even today, when someone is over the top. But it comes from this, World War I and the Western Front. Over the top was sort of when the commander blew the whistle or gave the signal, and everyone came out of the relatively protected environment of the trenches and made their way across no man's land, knowingly walking or running, oftentimes walking, into deadly enemy fire. Zero. A shrill whistle. The wave of a cap. Men clamber up ladders. Over the top. Physical nakedness is the first sensation. The body is now exposed, tense, expectant, awaiting direct violence upon it. And keep in mind, sometimes these guys were in the trenches for days at a time without coming out. And so being out in the open like that just would be a shock, knowing that you're under fire. You're not totally safe, sort of tucked into a trench either, but you're way more safe there than you are, and than these guys are here once they get out. So there was a sensation of nakedness and, being just totally vulnerable. And I've read a lot about this subject, as you may have been able to tell. But the natural human tendency in these kind of situations is for, without realizing it, I don't think people aren't consciously aware of it, but they tend to kind of clump together for comfort. But of course, that's the worst thing you can do when you've got artillery fire and machine gun fire coming at you, because the more you're spread out, the less, the fewer of you are going to get hit, wounded, or killed. So, but over the top is one of the, this moment is one of the kind of enduring symbols of the war, sort of enduring markers of this type of warfare. The devastating combination of machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire. Eckstein's again, the artillery barrage is deafening. When the air is still, the din can be heard in London and Paris. Sometimes the pounding lasts for days. In June 1916, at the Somme, it continues for 7 days and nights. Field artillery, medium artillery, and heavy howitzers. When the huge shells burst, they ravage the earth with their violence, hurling trees, rock, mud, torsos, and other debris hundreds of feet into the air. The 15-inch caliber gun of the British can fire a shell of 1,400 pounds. The officers, this is now one of those areas where it sort of skips. The officers went in front. What says one soldier? I noticed one of them walking calmly, carrying a walking stick. When we started firing, we just had to load and reload. They went down in their hundreds. You didn't have to aim. You just fired into them. So the like smoke clears, and this guy's like shocked to see the enemy sort of walking, shoulder to shoulder at them, with machine guns waiting to open up on them, and they did. So you don't have to even aim at them. You just pull the trigger, and they start going down. The barbed wire, which was invented, I believe, in the American West to keep cattle in and on ranches, was put to deadly use in warfare. Again, particularly maybe for the first time here. I forget where else it appeared and when in other parts of the world. But imagine the difficulties and the fear of going across no man's land into withering enemy fire with these kind of modern, extremely destructive weapons, but then being held up by row after row of barbed wire. And that makes you then even more vulnerable, even more open to getting hit. And of course, that's the point. The artillery barrages, in part, were meant to blow holes in the barbed wire, as well as kill people in the trenches. But they rarely did what they were really supposed to. They might blow 1 or 2 holes in a section. And on the offensive side, whether you see a British attack or a German attack going the other way, there were always a number of guys with wire cutters. So when they got here, they could cut holes so their comrades could go through. But you probably don't have to be told that usually the guy that started out carrying these, they were like big wire cutters. The guy who started out with them usually wasn't the one who ended up with them. They might be picked up several times on the way across no man's land. And okay, so you get maybe 2 or 3 holes either blown or cut into the barbed wire, so your regiment or battalion can go through in maybe 2 places. But that's hardly helpful, because all that means is now you're going through 2 funnels, and the enemy defending can just sort of turn all of their weapons towards those 2 funnels. And so the chances of even getting through, once you've cut the holes or blown the holes in the wire, are very low. So no wonder the casualty rates in battle after battle, basically every battle we talked about, with the possible exception of the Marne and like Tannenberg on the Eastern Front, was like this. So attacks failed over and over and over again at gigantic loss of life. Remember in one of the battles, I forget which one it was, the Germans defended, and there were 10 allies killed to every one German because the Germans were dug in with these kind of weapons in their trenches, and the French and the British were out in the middle of, out in the open in no man's land. And next we get to no man's land. Eckstein says the whole landscape of the Western Front became surrealistic. A panorama of devastation confronted the soldiers in the major battle zones. Trees had been reduced to charred stumps. Mud was ubiquitous. Only the thick, black rain out of the bruised and swollen clouds is fit atmosphere in such a land. The rain drives on. The stinking mud becomes more evilly yellow. The shell holes fill up with green-white water. The roads and tracks are covered with inches of slime. The black, dying trees ooze and sweat. It is unspeakable, godless, hopeless. The author has a poetic sense. This is certainly kind of dark poetry, to be sure, but that's not sort of what your normal historian would write. But that's part of the reason I like this book, is you really get a feel, as much as you can without being there. You can't truly get a feel without being there for this type of just almost unthinkable situation. The futility of frontal assaults, again, we've already talked about it really, a lot in this unit. This is a French attack, I think at Verdun. I forget. The French were on the defensive at Verdun, but in all these battles, there was certainly some back and forth. I think this might be Verdun. The victimized crowd of attackers in no man's land has become one of the supreme images of the war. Attackers moved forward usually without seeking cover and were mowed down in rows with the mechanical efficiency of a scythe, like so many blades of grass. The attacker became the representative of a world which was demolished by this war. So, the war on the Western Front is known for over-the-top, out into no man's land, and just futile, slaughter, out in, that open space. And of course, this comes with an unspeakable amount of carnage. And I hate to show these kind of pictures, but I believe it's important in a history course, to tell the truth. And we have to face, we don't really learn about the importance of this and the significance and what it meant and what it caused, what its significance was, unless we deal with the worst. This is a quote from a French soldier talking about a man in his unit. A guy's name was Gigoux. The death of Gigoux was atrocious. He was on the first steps of the dugout when a shell burst. His face was burned. One splinter entered his skull behind the ear. Another slit open his stomach, broke his spine, and in the bloody mess, one saw his spinal cord gliding about. His right leg was completely crushed above the knee. The most hideous part of it all was that he continued to live for 4 or 5 minutes, with his spine kind of going sort of back and forth like a snake, kind of still connected to his body, but not inside any longer. So I apologize, but again, this kind of thing is necessary, sadly. And there was a gigantic psychological toll as well. This is something that wasn't really talked about in those days. I mean, a little bit. There was a catch-all word or phrase for any kind of psychological issue, and that was shell shock. Basically, meaning you're in shock from all of the artillery fire and loud noises and explosions going off around you. But this got played down to some degree. There wasn't as much sympathy for what we call PTSD today. For psychological, emotional injuries that come through warfare. So these guys did get treated when they got, if they got sent back home or to behind the lines to a hospital. So it wasn't like there was no consideration for them and no treatment at all, but it wasn't like it is today. And Eckstein, I think, says this chillingly, but aptly. Soldiers in the post-war world withdrew from social activity and commitment. Relatively few were able to articulate their alienation. The incidence of mental illness among veterans was staggering. The burden of having been in the eye of the storm and yet having resolved nothing was excruciating. The result often was the rejection of social and political reality, and at the same time the rejection even of the perceptual self. Only dream and neurosis remained. A world of illusions characterized by pervasive negativism. Fantasy became the mainstream of action, and melancholy the general mood. Well, there's a real, happy note for us. But again, this is something that's not, I think, talked about that much when we go back, to wars before the 21st century. Since PTSD has been sort of a diagnosis, there's now less or little stigma attached to these kind of psychological wounds, thankfully. But in the First World War, those that suffered such illnesses, such problems, weren't treated as sympathetically. And there wasn't, of course, as much known about how to treat it. Now we get to phase 3 of our 3 C's. First causes, then conduct, now consequences. This is a famous picture we've seen before from July 1st, 1916, first day of the Battle of the Somme. Those are British troops in their trench. I'm not sure. It looks like they're about to go over the top. After the war was over, the world basically centered on Paris for a number of months, where the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 convened to try to figure out how to put the world back together again, to try to figure out how to put governments in place to redraw the map and borders of not just Europe, but the world. And the 4 individuals and gentlemen you see here really were kind of the key leaders with far more power than anybody else. All on the victorious side, which stands to reason. The Big Fours are sometimes referred to from left to right. David Lloyd George of Great Britain. I mentioned earlier that he'd been in the cabinet at the beginning of the war, but by now he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Vittorio Orlando next to him, chatting with him, Premier of Italy. Georges Clemenceau, President of France. And of course on the right, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. And these guys presided over a conference that had its work cut out for it. There was a lot to try to accomplish, and in the end it's usually seen as coming up far short of what was necessary. And we'll get into a little bit of the reasons why. There were a number of treaties signed as a part of the Paris peace talks in 1919. But the most famous and by far the most important of the treaties is the one you see here, the Treaty of Versailles. Why were there a number of treaties and why was this the most important? Because there was a separate treaty signed in and around the same area, the outskirts of Paris, where Versailles is, with each separate losing country. So there was the treaty signed, by Austro-Hungarian or former Austro-Hungarian leaders, Ottoman Empire, etc., etc. The Treaty of Versailles was the one that dealt with Germany, the most powerful and the most important because of its power country on the losing side in the war. So it's the Treaty of Versailles that gets the most attention still, as I'm giving it here, because it has so much impact on the world, on Europe, and not just here, but what's sort of going to happen next. It has a great deal of bearing on the onset and the advent of the Second World War. So the Treaty of Versailles was negotiated kind of as a centerpiece of the Paris peace talks, and one of the problems that was encountered was that the European leaders on the winning side, Orlando, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George, their countries had been in this war for the duration, and they'd suffered grievous damage to life and limb, to their social systems, economic systems, political systems, etc. And it was also sort of near and dear and close to them that, and these are all democratic countries, these are elected officials, the public was itching for revenge against Germany and the other losing powers. So they came at it from a spirit of a certain amount of vengeance, which they probably felt themselves, and a perceived need by Europeans on the other side of Germany and its allies in this war to keep Germany down in the future, to keep them from attacking. Germany was the first country to invade anyone else's soil in 1914, moving into the Low Countries and then into France, which is part of the reason why I think historians have been so quick to lay most of the responsibility at Germany's feet. But we already know that historians, none of them, conclude that Germany is solely at fault for the war. So there's a lot of sort of fingers that can be pointed in different directions. And right after the war, historians from each country, and for decades, again, surprise, surprise, started pointing the finger at other countries. It's their fault. No, it's their fault. No, it's your fault. But the Treaty of Versailles, the biggest problem sort of getting this through was the American president, Woodrow Wilson. Why? Well, Wilson wanted an idealistic peace. He wanted a treaty that didn't punish the loser, as treaties usually do in warfare. And so this automatically set him at odds with his other three allies, his other three colleagues in this conference and negotiating this treaty. Because he had, remember, sort of in contrast to what I just said about the European leaders, Wilson and the United States had only been in the war for a short time. Comparatively speaking, the losses were light, about 80,000 Americans killed, which is a great deal. But considering, I don't think I said this before, that France lost, I think, 2 million, Germany probably somewhat more than that, Great Britain had about close to 1 million killed in the war, all told, then 80,000 pales in comparison. So the U.S. didn't suffer nearly as much in another way as well, which is that none of the war took place on American soil. Zero. None of it. So America wasn't damaged socially, really not economically at all either. And so there wasn't as much suffering. So from the European point of view, from someone like David Lloyd George's point of view, Prime Minister of Great Britain, it looks like President Wilson, this guy can come kind of skipping across the Atlantic with this kind of carefree attitude. Hey, let's not worry about who won and lost and whose fault it is. Let's just sort of create a peace where we don't punish the loser and we set up a world. We use this conference and this treaty to try to set up a world that in the future will sort of bring lasting peace that will, keep these kind of wars from ever happening again. Or if one happens to break out, have a system in place, a set of rules in place globally that will at least mitigate the damage. Which, by the way, sounds like a great idea, and it was in many ways. So Wilson had an idealistic approach to how the peace should be done, and his cohorts here from Italy, France, and Great Britain had a more practical sort of series of goals in mind, and certainly the element of revenge, which isn't so much practical as it is emotional, but they're kind of combined together. So Wilson had been thinking about this for a couple of years. He had started the war. Remember, the United States was neutral at first and believing in American neutrality. But he had a change of heart as Germany did more and more things to anger American public opinion. And once Wilson changed his mind, he really changed his mind. Then he became a gung-ho ideologue in support of American values. And Wilson has had a tremendous impact on American history as a president in many ways. One of which is that it's really kind of from the time and presidency and war experience and leadership of Wilson that we see a strain of American foreign policy, which is still around, that Americans have by and large turned against this by today, but it's still there. An idealistic foreign policy that sort of sees the United States as better than everybody else, and that we're going overseas, over there, wherever there is. That's a phrase from the war, a song called Over There. But we're going over there and send our troops over there to bring democracy to the world, to bring freedom, equality, to protect human rights, because we're the country that does all those things better than everyone else, and we know about freedom and liberty and equality and democracy better than everyone. We know how to do it better than everyone else. So there was an idealism, an ideology behind this, and a certain arrogance, certainly a sense of self-righteousness, a crusading spirit that was a big part of, I think, Wilson's personality makeup. Sorry, I've been doing U.S. history lectures all day today too, and Wilson came from a Southern background. His father was a Protestant minister, and he does seem to that seems to have rubbed off on him in a secular way. He was kind of the secular version of a Christian, crusader from the Middle Ages. Believing that what he was doing was sort of, his righteous duty to help humanity. Wilson took himself very seriously then. So the phrases he used in speeches, most famously his 14-point speech that he made in front of a joint session of Congress at the beginning of 1918, said he dropped phrases like, this is going to be a war to save democracy. He called it a war to end all wars. So we're going to fight this war, and we're going to fight it hard. It's going to be bloody and destructive, but the goal is to use this bloody war to set up a post-war environment that will avoid these kind of wars in the future. He also wanted and called for a peace without victors, which was another way of saying that Wilson didn't think we should punish Germany. The victors should punish the losers, and he had a point there as well. In that, if the point being that it's not going to create likely a peaceful world if we punish Germany, because then they're just going to be bitter about it, and they're going to wait and rebuild and wait for another crisis whenever it is, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years later, and they're going to start a war sort of coming back at us. And the cycle will continue and continue as long as after every war, the winners punish the losers. And he was surely right about this. So then what's wrong with Wilson's position, his idealistic approach to the Paris peace talks? Well, first of all, he wasn't always consistent on this. Some countries were sort of held more accountable than others, so it wasn't quite consistent. The United States wasn't always, in his mind, the United States didn't have to play by the rules necessarily in certain ways, although he didn't necessarily see a contradiction in all this. But I think the biggest problem of all is that his idealism was so at odds with the European leaders' practical, realistic approach that he wasn't likely to get this done. They weren't going to go for that. The president had a lot of power here. He was just one of the four, amongst the big four, But it was the United States intervention in the war that did turn the tide. That's what gave Wilson his ability to influence this at all. So they had to listen to him. But nonetheless, in the end, he wasn't able to convince them to deviate in the direction of this idealistic, let's set up a peaceful world and not punish the loser. In fact, the other European leaders, his compatriots here, and his colleagues, got annoyed with him really quickly, and Wilson was extremely annoying. He was arrogant, full of himself, and really kind of saw himself as this, as the Messiah, a secular Messiah. I'm here to save the world, and we probably got a lot of kind of rolls of the eyes from, the European leaders that he's dealing with. In the end, from his 14 points, which he laid out in the United States, it was sort of, here are the 14 things we need to put into place to keep a war like this from happening again after we win it. And among those 14, the only one that he got into the Treaty of Versailles was the League of Nations, which you see near the bottom there. And the League of Nations was the most important in his mind of the 14 points. So he got the most important item on his agenda in. But he didn't get any of the rest of it because the others basically said no way, vetoed it. And they got in a whole lot of things that Wilson detested because they punished Germany and set the table for revenge and for German bitterness to turn into a vengeful war. Huge reparations payments. Germany was strapped for years with paying for the damage done by the war. The Treaty of Versailles limited German industrial and military production, basically made it so that Germany could not possibly produce enough steel and from there planes and tanks and ships to be a threat. So industrial / military production and a demilitarized zone, or a couple of them, in industrial centers of Germany, the Rhineland, for instance. They were open to Allied occupation and surveillance, so that the terms of the treaty said if you break any of these terms of the treaty about producing this or that, you produce too much of this or any of that, we reserve the right to send troops in and occupy. Or if you don't pay your reparations payments, we send troops in and occupy until you do, which happened at least once. French troops got sent in, I forget what year it was, to occupy German coal mines when Germany basically threatened to default on paying back its yearly, its nearest installment of reparations payments. The German military was limited, I think, to 100,000. For a country the size of Germany, even at that time, 100,000 in your army is tiny. It's like barely a police force. It's not even that. The League of Nations we'll talk about more momentarily. Most odious of all to Germany, and again the kind of thing that Wilson was trying to avoid, I mean for sure, is Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, known as the War Guilt Clause, which basically said in legalese language, we, Germany, accept that the war was our fault. And no German leader nor any German citizen believed that it was their fault. And of course it was partially their fault, but they were of course also partially right that it wasn't entirely their fault. But they had no choice. There was a virtual, and I do say virtual, gun pointed to their heads when they signed the treaty. And then you see a depiction of German leaders signing the treaty right there on the right. And who were these guys? Well, they probably should have been Hindenburg and Ludendorff. Remember, they absconded and took off. Didn't sort of stay for the responsible eating crow part of this whole war. And Germany had gone through or was in the midst of a revolution at this time. And so you see leaders of an gradually emergent republic, sort of a semi-left-leaning, sort of somewhat socialist / liberal republic that became known as the Weimar Republic. So these poor guys are brand new leaders in Germany, and they have no choice but to sign a document that they must have known German citizens were going to hate the moment they found out about it. And sure enough, the ink wasn't even dry on their signatures before every German, and I'm exaggerating slightly, of course, was forever embittered by this, completely. And it didn't even matter what happened next, because in the 1920s, the British and French leaders at that time, who weren't necessarily the same ones that were here, right? Leadership is changing hands as the years go by, started to think, you know what, maybe Woodrow Wilson was right, at least maybe partly right. Maybe if we let up on some of the terms of the treaty that were pretty harsh, maybe the Germans won't be so angry at us, and we can have better relations with them. And so they started to actually ease up on certain terms of the treaty into the 1920s about limits on industrial military production, etc. Well, too late, because the bitterness is already there. I always say this every time it comes up. It's just a simple sort of cheap analogy, but you get the point. It's like sometimes in a relationship. I don't necessarily mean like a romance relationship. It could be parental, mother father, father son, whatever, best friends. But in a relationship, sometimes if one person does something that's so out of balance to the other person, I mean, it doesn't always work out this way, but it does sometimes, right? If they do something so out of balance, it doesn't matter what the other person does to make up for it after the fact. The damage is done. And I forget, you go out and buy flowers, you say it, you apologize a million times, you buy gifts, no, sorry, what you did, I can't forgive, I can't, I can't forget it. So this is in a sense Germany's position. Once the treaty came out, it didn't matter how much the Allies let up on it after the fact. Damage done. And so one could say that Woodrow Wilson was right, that they should have imposed an idealistic peace that didn't punish Germany, and it might have helped. I think the simplest way to see how much of a disaster this treaty was in the end, though again, there are a lot of different interpretations on this complicated series of events and subject, but I would say this, that it might have been better, the treaty might have worked better had it been all of one or all of the other. Meaning if the European leaders had gotten their way and the whole thing was designed to keep Germany down in the future, or if the whole thing had been designed to pick Germany up off the mat and be nice to it, and not impose harsh conditions. But what happened was sort of middle of the road, and so both aspects then were watered down, and neither of them then really worked. And this we'll come back to, of course, because it's a major reason. I don't want to play this up too much. Historians do vary about how much they think the Versailles Treaty helps to explain the advent of the rise of Hitler and the Nazis in World War II. None of them, I think, would argue that it doesn't have anything to do with it. But in more recent years, it's been seen as less important than it once was. But it's still there. Europe after the Great War. Well, how did the map change? And this is partly, one of the things that had to get worked out at the Paris peace talks. 4 long-standing empires collapsed, went out of business because of this war. And we've dealt with all of them, some a lot, some a little bit. The Hohenzollern dynasty collapsed, which is the Prussian/German dynasty, going all the way back to Frederick the Great, and even before him, Frederick William. So the Hohenzollern dynasty is gone. The Habsburg dynasty collapses because Austria, of course, is on the losing side as well. The Romanov dynasty goes down, though the Russians were on the winning side. The war, as we have already talked about, set the table for the Bolshevik Russian Communist Revolution. And so the Romanovs went down in a slightly different way. But I didn't really emphasize this as much as I should have when we talked about this in the last segment. But I think it's safe to say that no World War I in Russia, no Bolshevik Revolution, no Communist Revolution. Maybe at a later time or something it could have happened, but it was the suffering and sort of the in the war, the hunger, the demonstrations and protests in huge numbers that caused the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, and then a number of months later, the Bolshevik takeover. So those steps, without the first step, the second one was extremely unlikely. And the Ottoman Empire, which this is the one we talked about the least because it isn't technically in Europe. We're not very far into Europe, but this was an empire that was once mighty and still had vast holdings of land, but it was already kind of teetering before. We've mentioned it. It was referred to, I think we mentioned it in the very first unit, in fact. By this time, and even in the 19th century, it was already being called the sick man of Europe. And the only reason that the Europeans kind of didn't basically just sort of get rid of it, take it off of life support, because the Europeans did help prop up the Ottoman Empire during this time period and throughout the 19th century. Not out of love for the Ottoman Empire, but there was sort of a feeling that, well, it'll just be easier if we just keep the sort of the Ottoman Turks sort of, in control of the, the part of the world they do control, which is Turkey, much of the Middle East, parts of North Africa. Because if it goes, there's going to be a huge vacuum of power, and then there's likely to be a war between us. We're all going to be greedy and try to sort of, get as much of that territory as we can, and it'll set off a general European war. They were, I think, correct, or they were right to at least worry that that was a possibility. So the Ottoman Empire got propped up, probably past sort of its normal lifespan, because the Europeans were just trying to kind of buy time and avoid a conflict that we know came anyway. So 4 long-standing monarchies, empires, collapse. Right? That's a huge change right there. And they were replaced with new nation states, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Austria as kind of a rump state now, not the previous whole Habsburg holdings, certainly not the whole Holy Roman Empire, but not the Habsburg monarchy, which included much of Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the new states carved out of the Habsburg dynasty. And so this sounds like, to the modern ear in a democratic society like ours, a good thing, period. Just a good thing. You've got these rickety old, unjust, monarchies and empires, now they're replaced by modern nation states, most of which were democratic, at least at first, after the war. Well, okay, in some ways I think that's true. But let's just take the Habsburg Empire, and I think it's the most blatant example of what I'm about to say. The Habsburg Empire, for all of its problems, it had been, for the most part, an absolute monarchy throughout, the duration of time we've been talking about in this entire class. So it wasn't a democratic country. It wasn't moving rapidly towards democracy like Great Britain and France and Low Countries were by this time. Nonetheless, the empire was so big, and we know was so multicultural and multi-ethnic. Not multicultural the way we use the word today, but meaning there was lots of cultural groups and ethnic groups living sort of in the Habsburg domains. And the Habsburg rule over, sort of being the overlords of all of them, kind of forced them all to get along in a way that once the Habsburg umbrella and sort of protective, shield was taken away, they don't have to get along any longer. And guess what? They don't. So one could say that the nation states, however modern, however good in certain ways, actually caused much more instability and much more ethnic conflict than would have been the case if the Habsburg monarchy would have survived. I'm not advocating its survival. I'm just trying to show you that these changes were not necessarily for the better, at least in the short run. And the last way to look at this, and I think the most salient, given what comes next in our class, is that where did Adolf Hitler, once he becomes chancellor and then dictator of Nazi Germany, what countries did he pick on first? He went to Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland, right? Fragments of what had once been sort of larger, bigger empires that would have been harder, not impossible, but harder to pick on had they still been sort of intact as empires. What about the culture of Europe, the intellectual life in Europe, as impacted, affected by the Great War? We, I think, already know that this is going to change things considerably. So let's go back to something we know in this class from an earlier unit, and that's the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was about belief and faith in progress, belief in reason and science, and if you were someone who believed all that, had imbibed, internalized all of those values and were proud of them as a British citizen or a French citizen, German citizen, this war likely shattered your belief in progress. Progress? We just spent the last 4 years killing each other to the tune of about 15 million people for what? How is that progress? The science that we have been touting since Isaac Newton has sort of produced weapons of mass destruction that helped kill those 15 million people. So this was incredibly disillusioning, the experience of the Great War. There are many books that show this. Two of the most famous, All Quiet on the Western Front, by an author, brilliant author, a German author who fought on the Western Front, Erich Remarque. His book is a work of fiction, but the main character in the book is a German soldier in the trenches, and it's autobiographical. And Remarque was sort of one of many post-war authors and intellectuals that, in his own writings, not necessarily explicitly, but through interpretation, clearly showed signs of asking, now doubting what had once been, taken as sort of the gospel in European society with regard to progress, reason, science. Another famous example of the same tendency in intellectual life in Europe is a book, an autobiography or memoir called Goodbye to All That, you see on the right, by Robert Graves, a British officer during the war. And he said, at the beginning of the book, I read it when I was in college, All Quiet on the Western Front, by the way, if you haven't ever read that, you should. Everyone I know that's read it, every student, says the same thing. They couldn't put it down. It's not that long, but it's riveting. In some ways, Remarque's book is an anti-war novel. It's been portrayed that way a lot. And I wouldn't say that's entirely wrong, but if you read Remarque's, some of his other novels, his other novels are excellent as well. This is by far the most famous. But he actually had a fascination with violence. There's no doubt that All Quiet on the Western Front comes across as extremely critical of the war and the leaders and why the war happened in the first place and its incredible titanic cruelties. But there's also in there again a sort of a psychological fascination with violence and war as well. So it's not entirely an anti-war novel, but it certainly, I think, can be read profitably that way. Graves says at the beginning of his memoir, and by the way, I'm inserting a lot of things here, but before I forget, Robert Graves went on to have a brilliant career as an expert in the classics, expert on ancient Greece and ancient Rome. He wrote a 2-volume historical novel about the Roman Empire, early years of the Roman Empire. Called I, Claudius. And the second volume was called Claudius the God. And so he became a pretty well-known intellectual and writer, well after the war was over. But Graves said, I resolved in this book never to make England my home, means again, which explains the goodbye to all that of this title. So, in a sense, what Graves is saying, I read the book, so I'm kind of paraphrasing for you here, is that this war shattered my ability to believe in the Western tradition, to believe in the values of Western civilization, which really, again, go back to the Enlightenment. And so, it's so much so that I can't even live in Great Britain any longer. I think he lived most or all of his life in Spain, or at least Mediterranean countries. No part of it was Spain. So these are two of the most famous, maybe the two most famous, but there are many others that you can see if you read their work post World War I that show clear signs of having lots of skepticism and doubt about the European value system and where Europe goes from here. Is there any meaning to sort of Europe's value system that had been so full of itself and so confident in itself? That stuff started to waver. Not necessarily forever, not that it couldn't and didn't make a comeback, but this is a serious intellectual, kind of psychological, cultural crisis.